Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 4th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download as long as we can keep making the show. We're going on over 11 years now. We are at episode, I have it here somewhere. We're at episode 562. Oof. We started all the way back in 2014. The industry has changed quite a lot. Advertising is not quite as big a part of it, although you do sometimes hear programmatic ads. Frustratingly, I know. But they just really don't support the show the same way as host-read ads. So we're increasingly relying on the support of individuals just like you. The platform we use, as most podcasters use, is Patreon. So if you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. Every little bit counts. But speaking of not so little bit, I want to thank those of you who are my top patrons for the month. You include Anu Badavaj, Chuck Blell, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Joseph Lamore, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to speak with Anne E. Greene, a biologist who's interested in how scientists communicate their research to a broader audience. She's taught scientific writing to undergraduates in wildlife biology, geology, and neuroscience at the University of Montana for 15 years. And she also taught workshops on scientific writing to grad students and faculty, and to scientists in NGOs, private research institutions, and federal agencies across the country. She has, I won't call it a new book out because it's actually the second edition now, but because of that, it is new. And it's called Writing Science in Plain English. So without any further ado, here she is, Anne E. Greene. Anne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Cara. I'm very happy to be here.
So I am excited to talk to you about your new old,
I know.
how do I put this book? Yeah, Writing Science in Plain English, the second edition. So let's just get right into it. When did the first edition come out?
The first edition was published in 2013, so just a little bit over 10 years ago.
Wow. Okay. And so you're a biologist, you're also a science communicator, and you're interested in sort of the science of science communication, as well as the more practical, obviously, components of the art and the science. Tell me, how did you first sort of kind of move your sights into psychom and away from just classical bench science?
It was a gradual thing for me. It didn't occur at any one particular point. In high school, I attended a convent of the Sacred Heart, which is sort of like the female equivalent of the Jesuits, teaching. We got an incredibly strong background in literature, in writing and grammar, Latin. We did a lot of Latin and reading. I hardly got any science at all in high school. It was really focused on writing and reading and history, that sort of thing, literature. And then when I went to college, I've always been interested in the natural world, and the head of the department at a small university in Nova Scotia, where I'm from originally, convinced me to go into biology. So, and I enjoyed it very, very much, but I almost went into English lit in college. And kept my interest up after I left. I did graduate work in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on seabirds, and which is very, very fun. I was out in the ocean with fishermen watching seabirds a lot, and on colonies off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. It was amazing. But I always sort of kept this love of writing and reading on the back of my mind. And when I left Nova Scotia and we went down, my husband and I, to the States, I started working at museums and setting up displays and educational projects and just information for visitors to the museum using the specimens that were there. And it was really a kind of a neat, I did quite a bit of writing, and it was a neat sort of middle ground between communicating to the general public and science. And then when we finally landed in Missoula, Montana, after my husband's PhD and his postdoc, I was lucky enough to get a job at the Writing Center at the University of Montana. And there I was really able to delve into writing in a big way and keep my fingers in the science arena as well. And I found it very rewarding. And I was asked to teach a scientific writing class honors in the honors college in wildlife biology at the University of Montana. And I did that for 15 years, and it was fabulous. I loved it. And I was so motivated by certain information, certain books that I had read to prepare myself for this job of teaching, that at the college level, that I thought the information was important enough for scientists to write the book. And then the second edition, it's been quite popular, I think, and I hope that it'll continue to be so, especially when there's a teacher's guide with lots of activities and assignments to go along with it. So that's sort of the trajectory. I hope I didn't go on too long for you.
Not at all. No, I think it's such an important skill set that is not, at least maybe I should say historically and traditionally, taught or fostered among science students. Just like we often talk about how teaching is the same way. Like, let's say you fall in love with science in your undergrad, you decide to pursue it, you end up getting a graduate degree, you get that, PhD, you start a lab, and you're lucky enough to get a great appointment at a university. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, by the way, you need to teach all these classes. And people are very often like, I don't know how to do that. Like, no one taught me that. Yeah, it's not part of the curriculum at all.
Exactly. It's a great failing, I think, that there just isn't time, I guess, they feel in graduate school to, and this isn't, across the board. I know that there are very good classes in how to teach and writing in some universities, but as a general rule, I know that, I wasn't prepared, particularly my husband wasn't prepared. You're supposed to, and my husband has had a long career of over 30 years teaching many, many courses at the University of Montana. It's hard work. And you aren't particularly prepared about how to do it efficiently and how to get across information in a clear way for students at their level. You have progressed way beyond the level of these undergrads, but you have to make your teaching message available to them and understandable for them. And if you, for instance, get up in the front of a lot of undergrads and you speak as if you're speaking to your grad students in your lab, it won't work, and there's so much to teaching, and that it's a failure in grad school not to teach. These people are going to go on, at least the ones who have got ideas of or plans to teach at a university. They really need instruction, and the writing is another thing that gets sidelined often. What happens frequently is your advisor is the one who is reading your proposals and who is reading your papers before you submit them to publication or that sort of thing. And your advisor may or may not have had instruction on how to write clearly for a broad audience. And pass on what they learned from their English teachers, and then you pass that on to your students, and this goes on for generations. When really it's a whole different attitude that's described in my book, and that is, what does your reader need from you? Not how can you be a good writer, but it's the whole focus of the book is what does your reader need from you in order to understand information that's complicated and new to them. And there's this set of principles, and it's very easy to learn them. But you just have to be cognizant of that. You have to be aware of who you're writing for. And if you want to reach a broad audience, which why would you not want to reach a broad audience? You're going to all this trouble writing this paper or this proposal or this, and many times these committees or the boards that are NSF groups that are put together to look at some of this stuff, they aren't in your field, all of them, or maybe none of them, maybe. That you need to be able to explain your science in straightforward, plain English, So yeah, we're often, it's rare for people to learn this. It's really too bad. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the books.
Yeah, and I would say it's not it's a twofold problem because it's rare for people to learn how to write plainly and cleanly for a broad audience, but I would also argue that for many of my colleagues and peers in academia, it's rare for them to learn to write at all. Like, they do write, and you write often as a scientist. I'm lucky in some ways because although I do consider myself a scientist, I'm more of a social scientist. My PhD is in clinical psychology, but I do have a master's in biology. And so I did kind of both bench work and very, human sciences. But my experience was exactly as you described it. Depending on the course I was taking and the papers that were required for that course, I either got very good feedback on my writing or I got almost no feedback on my
Yes,
writing.
yeah, it varies a lot. Yeah.
It does, because there's not really I mean, at least in the APA, the American Psychological Association, we have an entire style guide, so like at least there's some standard that we have to follow. But a lot of times you're right, not only do we not get a lot of instruction in just how to write, then there's an expectation within the field of writing in the most wonky, esoteric
I
way possible.
I agree 100%. I agree 100%. Yeah. And there's a sort of a history about that goes back to 11th century, what is now England, and I'm sure you know about this story, but at the
I don't think I
time.
do. No.
Oh,
Please
wow.
enlighten me. Yeah, I had no
Okay.
idea it was that old. Like, we've been that pretentious for that long.
Well, this is kind of when it started, at least one of the theories. So at the time, in what is now England, the people were speaking a language called Anglo-Saxon or Old English. And it's a Germanic-based language. And it's full of lots of short words that have broad applications. All our main verbs like to be, to have, to make, to go, words like man, woman, sun, moon, earth, child, all our prepositions on, in, at, by, with, from. These are short, simple words that have been derived from Anglo-Saxon. In 1066, the Norman French invaded England, and it was this crown was contested, and William the Conqueror landed and invaded England and won the Battle of Hastings, which gave them control over England. And they brought with them their language, which in official business, that was Latin, and then later on transferred to Norman French. So the institutional language that the Normans worked in, that is institutions like education or religion or law, and science, politics. Those institutions were mainly run in Latin at the beginning, or the language used in those was Latin, and later Norman French. So if you wanted to work and get a job in any of those areas, you had to learn, apart from your Anglo-Saxon language, you had to learn a new language that was Latin-based and later Norman French-based. And the words of the Latin words and the Norman French words were almost always longer and more formal than the Anglo-Saxon. So the English language became sort of two-tiered. So the man in the street who was selling his apples out of his cart, he was speaking Anglo-Saxon. The man who was working in science or in law or in religion, he had to learn a new language peppered with these longer, more complicated words based out of Latin or based on Latin and Norman French. And it's still the same today. So these longer, more formal words became part of the lexicon of these institutions. And when you or I are talking to our friends or our family, 80% of our words are Anglo-Saxon, short, simple words. But once we switch to talking about our science or our law profession or our medical profession, all of a sudden we use 3 times as many words that have bases in Latin and Norman French, which are longer and more complicated. And that it's still the same today. And who can resist using those longer, more formal words? They make you sound smart, right?
Well,
and you sound different than other people, and that's a good thing. And so you write the same way. You use these words like, anthropomorphic, and you use words like demonstration, and you use all these words like that are long, and they're often have shorter, simpler synonyms.
it's interesting because in some ways I don't want to say I assumed or I thought that it was the opposite problem, but maybe these two forces are happening at the same time. It's that very often these long, complex words stand in for maybe a much longer explanation, but full of shorter, easier to understand words. And so we often feel like we're using shorthand with our peers and colleagues so we don't have to over-explain or use a lot of words in place of this one word that has so much meaning. But that one
Yes.
word is really technical and specialized.
Yeah. And the secret of using, like, evolution is a word that describes a very complicated process, and we use it a lot. And as long as your audience, the people who are going to read your writing or listen to your talk, know what evolution means, then that's a great word to use, because it's a shorthand form. It's a shorthand way of explaining a complicated thing. But if your audience doesn't know what evolution means, or they misunderstand what evolution means, then you have to explain it, at least at the beginning.
Yeah. And we don't want to overwhelm people with too much explanation. So it's a tough balance to sort of I mean, I know that this has long been a struggle for a lot of, again, my peers and colleagues who work in science communication. I myself don't write as much as I speak in science communication. Like I've hosted a lot of television shows. I've been podcasting for many years. I give talks quite often. I do write from time to time. I am interested in diving more into writing, which is probably my kind of unconscious bias for why I wanted to talk to you on the show. But I struggle. I struggle with that as well. And one of the pieces of advice that an editor recently gave me was you need to dictate. Like you just need to sit down and talk into your computer. You can edit it later.
Yeah.
But if that's more comfortable for you, you're going to have blank page anxiety if you're trying to put it all through your fingertips.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was indicating when I was saying, if you're talking to your friends or your family, you can kind of you'll end up using, if you imagine you're talking to your grandmother across the table, you'll be using shorter words, I would think. that kind of thing. But there's no reason to say ascertain when you can say find, and there's no, and there's no way, the reason to say subsequent, and you can just say next. I mean, in terms of the written word on the page, there's problems too with writing big words that have to do with our eyes, with the reader's eyes. So we just can't see and we can't fixate on long words very well because we have this tiny little place in our retina called the fovea. It's just a dimple, but it's packed with high resolution cells that are the only part of the retina that's good for reading, that's adequate for reading. And I mean, because it's so small, I mean, the fovea can only fixate on like 7 letter spaces at a time. You've watched people read and their eyes are flicking back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That's where they're fixating on the words as they're reading. So if you have lots of short words that only need to be fixated once or maybe not at all, like you can swim through like ahs and thes and ands and things like that. But if you have a long word like demonstration or attribution or interpretation, often that requires you to fixate on the beginning of the word and then the end of the word. You have to fixate twice on it, which slows the reader down a lot.
It does. It slows the reader down. And it also, just in terms of like accessibility, and inclusivity, I often think about this, and I hope my boyfriend doesn't mind my mentioning this on air. But so he is dyslexic and very often we'll read to each other or we'll do like the New York Times crossword together. My favorite way to do the crossword is for somebody to read me the clues and me not look at it and just engage with it like in my own like my mind's eye. But very often what will happen, because the New York Times crossword is notorious for, big, overwrought, ridiculous words, is that he'll see a different word than what's actually there because his mind will sort of jump to a conclusion about what it likely is based on, I guess, phonemes or based on the beginning and the end of the word. And so then we'll be grappling with a clue that's actually not the right word because it's a different tense or it's a related word. And I think a lot of people with ADHD, a lot of people with dyslexia or other types of like learning or reading disabilities very often do struggle the more kind of visually complex the words become.
Ah, that's a good point. I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's a very good point that I hadn't thought of before.
But at the same time, and I'm curious what your take, I'm sure you've heard all of the devil's advocate arguments here, but I'm trying to channel, I think, one of the greats, Carl Sagan, and think about like, what would Carl Sagan do? That's like a bracelet I should probably wear. What would Carl Sagan do? But so I think that on the one hand, the plain language, what are the simpler and easy to digest words that are very straightforward and clear? I think he would advocate for using those as often as possible. Like you said, you don't need to use the word ascertain. But on the other hand, and maybe this is also my own personal bias, part of having a rich vocabulary is engaging with literature. And I do love learning unique, or I guess it's more like emotionally laden words, like words that have a lot of prosody to them. When I read and I come across a new word that just captures a concept so perfectly,
True. Yeah.
I love sharing that, but I want to read those words because I think that they give me a richer inner world and a richer ability to communicate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I understand that. I sort of, I throw this English background, but I go back to Winston Churchill, and he said, I mean, his audience was huge. He was trying to keep a whole country motivated during the darkest hours and of the Second World War. But his oratory was famous and inspirational. And he said, short words are the best. Old words, if they're short, are the best of all. So these for him, these old Anglo-Saxon words, which everybody knows, and You see, what you want your reader or your listener to do is get your message loud and clear. They shouldn't even notice the writing. And this, I understand completely. I'm the same way when I read, magazines that I love that have very good writing in them. I have my dictionary, my abridged Oxford dictionary sitting next to me. It's my favorite activity, practically. I'm totally nerdy about this. And I love looking up these words that are used seldom, but they do express an idea perfectly. And a scientific writer does have to worry about being accurate. And not many, but several times I have been criticized, and rightly so, for revising complicated, obtuse, abstract writing and not getting it right, not being as attentive as I should have been to to accuracy while I'm revising. And that's has to be the case. You have to maintain accuracy when you are, editing your own writing for, say, complicated long words that may not be necessary. You have to make sure that, am I getting the message across well? Am I being accurate? And sometimes the writing is so complex and so convoluted and so obtuse that it's almost impossible, unless the writer is sitting next to you, to understand what they mean. So I had an example in the book. The variation in survivorship, referred to as density-dependent mortality, has also been related to negative plant soil biota feedbacks described for a temperate (Parker and Clay 2000) and tropical tree species (Hood et al. 2004). Period. So,
I assume that's an example of what you don't want to do when you're writing science.
Yeah. And it was so complicated that for years, my revision in the 2013 edition of the book was incorrect. I had the two temperate and tropical species reversed with the wrong citation. And I didn't, it wasn't until someone pointed it out to me that, oh, yeah, that's wrong. Okay. But that's what happens. That's the danger of writing this way. People will get completely the wrong idea, perhaps, of what it is you're trying to say.
Yeah. And so it's a tough thing, though. I often speak with sort of early career scientists or even science students who are interested in transitioning to writing or doing more science communication. It's a tough thing to unlearn that. So I'm curious what kinds of tricks or tips or what kind of advice. I mean, it's one thing to talk about this conceptually, but then to sit down and actually do it. Okay, speaking out loud, that's a really great. I mean, I always say that. After you write something, read it and read it out loud because you do not know. And I was just struggling. I'm working on a TV show right now where I'm just doing voiceover. And very often when I get the first scripts and I sit down and I'll do a cold read and I'm like, oh, we have to completely edit this. Like we just used the same word 3 times in that sentence. We can't, that's not how people talk. And it's not an uncommon experience for me. So I think that why not read it out loud to see how it flows, to see how it sounds, to see if you yourself are even tripping over the words as you're trying to read it. Like that's the advice I've always given to myself, but I'm curious if you have any other tricks or tips or just best practices that you'd like to share.
No, I think that's an excellent one. Reading it out loud is a wonderful one. Having someone else read your writing is a really good idea. I think if more people realized that writing is revision, that would help a lot. It's an attitude, you see. There's very, very, very few people who can write a first draft and have it, good the first time. I think if people realized more how important it was to revise their writing, that first draft is a rough draft. That's just a beginning. That's just something that you can work on. It's good to have something written down that you can work on. And it might actually help with writer's block if you don't stress out over every single word as you're writing your first draft. It's a complete waste of time. But that's what often happens with people who have writer's block. There was a wonderful Betty Sue Flowers was a teacher at one time in Texas. She's now in Washington, D.C., but she had a wonderful way of conceptualizing the writing process. It really helped, I think, a lot of her students, and it got them over the problem of not being able to write, and then also realizing how much revision there was. But she described writing a building process. So there were characters involved in the building process. And the first person was the creative, crazy, person who with all the ideas and messy, didn't really care about details, just scribbled down these ideas as they came. Then next comes up the architect. And the architect takes those ideas and places them in a structure which will work for a reader. Readers expect certain things. They expect introductions and bodies of essays where it's developed and conclusions, and they expect certain things in those parts. So the architect takes care of that. Then there's the builder who comes along, and they take care of the sentence structure, the word choice, and they clean that up, and they do the next. Then at the very end comes the judge. And the problem with many, many writers is they have judges interrupting all these other characters' jobs and their work. And the judge gets in the way and says, that I should be dotted and that T should be crossed and that sentence is not correct. The judge should be waiting at the very end to edit, to do the editing, and maybe several times to make sure that you get a finished product at the end. But that's kind of a neat way to think about the writing process. But I've always found that having someone else read, someone with a different set of eyes, someone with a different, who isn't familiar with the subject, hopefully, ask them, do you understand this? Is this clear to you? And what suggestions do you have? And what examples did I miss? And all sorts of this wonderful way of expanding what you can encompass in this piece of writing. Do you see what I mean? It's so much better if you get someone else reading it and who's conscientious and gentle and not too critical of you to read it over. Someone who is serious about it. It just doesn't, skim it and say, oh yeah, it looks fine. But someone who's seriously interested in helping you. That, to me, that has been the greatest help.
I love that, because I think that I struggle with maybe it's not an appropriate way to conceptualize writing, but one of the things that personally I struggle with, and I've talked to a lot of people who struggle with this as well, is there are plenty of people who follow that lovely advice of just kind of get something on the page and then the other, like, you're going to edit it later. And so I know people who are professional science writers who are like, oh yeah, I'm a 5 draft writer or I'm an 8 draft writer. And I'm like, I'm a 2 draft writer. It's like, I cannot just sit down and barf something out. I'm like struggling with it the whole time I'm writing it, because there's this feeling in me that it doesn't flow right or it doesn't feel right. And I need to get it right before I can then edit it to make it perfect. Like, it has to be really good and then I can make it perfect. But I think I'm just getting in my own way.
Yeah, the judge is getting in your way. So you just have to put the judge away for a while and not let him or her or them come into the process at all. Just don't worry about any kind of fine detail at all. Even paragraph, no paragraph structure, just write. I mean, it'll be sentences, and their ideas will form into groups, I imagine. If you do a little bit of, there's ways of organizing your ideas with an outline or So, there's various ways of preparing to write before you actually sit down and write that first draft. Don't let the judge bother you until until the end of the
Right,
process.
until it's time for judgment. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting when I think about very often when I have writers on the show, because this show, every week I interview usually a different scientist or science writer, although I have been venturing more and more often into like social justice issues. But very often I am talking to people who write for a living, or at least writing is a portion of their career. And I used to sort of probably overly binary a lot of the science writers that I would interview, where I would talk to them about like, hey, did you start as a scientist and then you got interested in writing, or did you like go to J school and then you discovered science as an interesting beat? And I always kind of had this like journalism lens, which is probably really unfair because like you, I'm sure many of them actually started in like English literature or started in creative writing, or had this love for a kind of non-journalistic approach to writing. It is interesting that to me, it seems like all paths can lead to this shared discipline or this shared experience, but maybe the practitioners, the people who are doing the writing do come at it from a different lens. Like some people are like, here's an idea that's really important. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this idea is received. And other people might be like, here is a feeling that I want to evoke, and I'm going to use prose to evoke this feeling, or I want this to be more poetic, or I want this to be very kind of clean and logical. And I can imagine that those different sensibilities do affect people's writing, right? Like you've read books where you're like, "Oh my God, this book." I just read a book called Orbital, which won a bunch of awards, and it's just like dripping with like emotion. And it's so evocative, this book. The writing is phenomenal. But at the same time, some people might get lost in the prose.
I guess I'm kind of a little bit losing you on the emotive part. I mean, if I had a hard enough time, I think, with this book, trying to convince scientists that stories are important. Right. So one reviewer of my original proposal wrote back very vehemently, "My science is not a story." So stories is the term story is loaded in science because a lot of scientists feel stories are made up, whereas
Oh, right. So they
yeah,
they they equate it with fiction.
that's true, and they think
Wow. Okay.
that their science is about the real world. It's about facts. And stories have no place there. In addition to that, a well-known paleoecologist at Harvard was when sociobiology first came came to be recognized as a science. This paleoecologist was very critical of the research in early sociobiology and called it just so stories, which refers back to Kipling's books or stories about how the leopard got his spots and how the elephant got his nose. And it's completely, the antithesis of evolution. But they're great stories. But anyway, John Alcock, who is a wonderful, wonderful scientific writer and science writer, called that term "just so stories" is the most successful derogatory term that's ever been invented. Because now a story is equated with bad science, whether or not that's true. It's just, that's what happened. And so there's lots of reasons for when you mention the word story to a scientist, there's lots of reasons for them to say, no, that's not what I'm doing. But story in my book is just defined as linguists define it. It's just simply a very effective way to communicate to an audience. That's it. And we've been, whether, you cannot deny, we've been telling each other stories for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And our brains are wired up to engage with stories of certain structure, of, concrete things doing something, like concrete things like that you can experience with your senses, doing something, expressed in concrete nouns and strong verbs. So if you want, and there's really convincing research going on in Princeton right now with Yuri Hassan is doing it, Dr. Yuri Hassan. And they are putting people in fMRI machines and looking at what their brains are doing while they're reading stories. And the brains of these people are doing exactly what the actions of the stories are describing. So if the main character is running down an alleyway, the part of their brain of the reader that takes care of running is fired up. It's all lit up. So if you want to, you can make the brain of your reader do what you want with your writing, essentially, if you do it in the right way. Why wouldn't you want to do that? But yeah, stories. I'm I'm trying to convince people to write stories, not like, this emotive writing is, that's another step beyond that.
And I guess I didn't think of it that way because I've been doing SciComm for so long. I've worked in, I used to go to Science Online and I used to teach science communication workshops. And I've been so steeped in this world for so long. It's the water that I swim in. I take that for granted, the storytelling component for granted. And I'm over here grappling with the concept of big words from a literary perspective as opposed to technical, staunch kind of like stuffy and esoteric journal article writing. So yeah, maybe I kind of like swung the pendulum a bit far.
Yeah.
And that is something that many people do also play with. And I think some of the most beautiful science writing that I've read is not just, obviously, it's all telling lovely stories, but it's telling stories that are full of detail and that are really evocative, that really paint a picture in your mind's eye.
Well, yeah, all I'm asking scientific writers to do, which is very, very straightforward and easy to do in their journal papers and in any of their other writing, is simply use concrete nouns as subjects and strong verbs to describe the action.
I love that.
And it's surprising how few concrete nouns scientific writers use now. They use abstract nouns instead. And an abstract noun comes from a verb or an adjective. So
what's an example of that?
To demonstrate is a perfectly good verb. But instead of using demonstrate, many scientific writers changed it to an abstract noun, demonstration. So they make that the subject of the sentence. Instead of we, the scientists, demonstrated that instead of that, the sentence would read, the demonstration of this particular process was discovered or was shown. Oh my God, shown.
It was demonstrated that. Yeah,
that's another thing.
An active to passive voice.
Yeah, that's another issue is passive voice. But the fact that you have a subject in your sentence, that the reader is trying to understand from the subject what this story, this writing is about. And if you present the reader with an abstract noun, the demonstration, how can they conceive of a demonstration?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How can they? But if you write we, the scientists, that's sort of a concrete thing. We know you are a scientist or your group are scientists and we can imagine them in the lab and, it's something concrete. But the demonstration, forget it. So immediately, as soon as you use that as your subject, and invariably, since you are using up your strong verbs and making them into nouns, you end up with have shown as a verb. Yep. A weak verb, right? There's no action in have shown. No action at all. So all of a sudden, you have no story. what we're calling a story, which is the essential way to communicate with an audience. We're just wired up. Our brains are wired up like that. You can't get away from it. And you are lost. You've lost your audience right away.
Yeah, because
They're
it's like
gone.
you're just reading them a list.
Oh,
Like it's literally like they're reading a grocery list, and that's not compelling.
Well, they're in a fog is what they're in. I'd love to put somebody in an fMRI machine and give them really bad scientific writing to read and see what happens in their brain. I don't think there's very much happening at all.
No, or their default mode network just takes over and they're daydreaming. I have a feeling
exactly.
they just fully don't. Yeah, they just fully kind of lose the thread. It is fascinating to think about, and I can't help but like. There's two things that come up for me that I'd love to cover before we wrap up. But the first one is something that comes up for me personally as a clinical psychologist. I don't use projective tests much, but I was trained in them like all psychologists are. And one famous projective test, most people have heard of the Rorschach, but another famous projective test is the thematic apperception test, where you look at a series of images. They're like drawings, and they're mostly pretty antiquated, like pencil drawings or charcoal drawings. And then you ask the participant, the patient, the subject, whatever, to tell you a story, to look at the drawing and then tell you a story. And very often when they struggle with what that means, you tell them, there are characters that are doing something, and there's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Oh,
and
that's
all
very
you really
good.
have to say, like, what are the subjects in the picture doing? And make sure there's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah,
and then you get all these really compelling arcs.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent.
Yeah, if you don't give that instruction, very often people will just describe what they see like they're reading a list.
Yeah.
And that's a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's very, very encouraging that you describe a story like that to them, and then they respond and do what you ask them. But this is the kind of writing that this was a student writing this. So they're trying very, very hard to mimic the kind of writing that they read and that is given to them to read in assignments. So the inhalation of vapor phase particulate matter chemical contaminants from biomass combustion in domestic settings is a significant contributor to local disease burden. 22 years. So the subject of that sentence is inhalation. And then there's of vapor phase particulate matter chemical contaminants. So vapor phase 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 noun string, a string of 6 nouns, and the reader doesn't know which one is important for them to concentrate on, so they skip those. So inhalation of vapor phase particulate matter chemical contaminants, and then there's another prepositional phrase from biomass combustion, two nouns together, in another prepositional phrase in domestic settings. So there's three prepositional phrases between the subject, inhalation, which is abstract, and the verb is.
I love it. It just is. Yeah.
It just is. A significant contributor to local disease burden. So there's lots and lots of problems. There's the reader's forgotten what the subject is by the time they get to the is. So they have to go back. We had to go back to find the inhalation is a significant contributor. And the problem, like, we can make it so much more simple. We can get rid of all those prepositional phrases and things, and we can just say domestic wood smoke causes local health problems.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I didn't know who the subject was based on that, but I was going to say something like, when frogs inhale smoke, they get sick.
Exactly. And smoke is something concrete. We can smell it. We can see it. It's concrete. And domestic smoke. What does domestic smoke do?
Right.
The reader was desperate to find out what is happening. And you do not want to make them wait for, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 words before they find what it did. So you always want to probably put your verb right after your subject. So the reader doesn't have to wait or doesn't, have to wade through words to find out what did the smoke do? Domestic smoke, wood smoke causes. Oh, thank you. Local health problems. I mean, it's hard work to learn how to write that badly. And
It's true. It's really
yeah,
beat into you over several years of a
yeah.
PhD.
Yeah, and you read it over and you read it over and over and over and over, and you say, this is the way they want me to write. I can write like this, I think. And then someone like me comes along and says, no, you shouldn't be writing like that. And they say, what? I've been working on this for 4 years for my degree. Don't tell me I
How
don't.
dare you?
Yeah, exactly. And when they're in their careers as, early faculty, there's no hope. There's no way.
Or tenured faculty. Yeah, faculty
no
has been doing it for a long
because
time. Yeah.
this kind of writing we're talking about is rewarded. You don't get a paper rejected on the basis of bad writing. You get it rejected on the basis of bad statistics or a bad hypothesis or no hypothesis or whatever. But very rarely will an editor of a major journal write you back and say, well, they will write you back and say cut by 1/3. That will improve a lot. But they won't reject your paper, I don't think, usually on the basis of this is very poor writing. We can't accept it until you send it back and write it in more plain English or in a style that can be easily understood.
But what will happen is you may not get that funding because that, congressional committee or that, panel that's reading your proposal or your grant application may go, I don't know what these people are saying that they're doing, but it doesn't seem to be that important.
What? Because it's in plain English? Or because
it's not in plain English. Yeah, because
exactly.
it's so incredibly esoteric that they'll be like, this is over my head, and it all just feels very like it doesn't apply to the real world issues. I think that if somebody works really hard to tell a story and to put things in plain English and to say, this is how we're going to hopefully help patients down the line, or these findings help us understand why so many people are getting sick when they spend time in urban areas, or whatever the case may be, so that somebody can not just see it, hear it, understand it plainly, but imagine their own children, imagine being exposed to something, imagine the people in their lives, or the animals that they can conjure in their minds. Like, if you can, I guess it's hard where I'm trying to go with this, and it's hard because I have aphantasia on my mind because I've been covering that a lot lately. So apologies to all of my listeners who are aphantasics or who don't have a mind's eye or an inner voice. But I would say it's somewhat more normative to have a mind's eye and an inner voice. And very often we have to be able to evoke pictures or to hear things in our brains. And when we can do that, they've become more real to us. And when you read, like you mentioned, these strings of complex words that are where it's difficult to pinpoint the subject, it's difficult to pinpoint the action, we don't know where it's going or what it's doing, it just becomes wallpaper. It's, it's hard to know the point.
Yeah. I when I was writing the book, the first edition, I really didn't have too much trouble finding bad examples of writing and I tried to cover as many branches of science as I could. But the hard part was finding really, really good writing. And I found it among many Nobel Prize winners, or Watson and Crick, for instance, with their one-page paper in Nature in 1953 that won them a Nobel Prize on the structure of DNA. 60% of the words in that paper are Old English, short Old English words. And, when I look at other Nobel Prize winners' writing, it's similar, Yeah. So that was a treasure trove for me to find such good writing there.
Yeah, and I don't want to bias I feel like I am lucky enough that I have interviewed so many incredible science writers on this show. But one that sticks out so much to me, and she's I come back to her writing again and again as Mary Roach. And she's not a scientist, but the way that she writes about science is so compelling. It is so easy to read, and she definitely knows how to tell stories.
Wow, that's great. I'll write that
Yeah,
down and look at.
absolutely. So I've got to ask you, Anne, the last question that really comes to mind for me is what's the difference between the first and the second? I mean, authors are so, I mean, it's such a celebrated thing to have written a book that is still so relevant and still so needed and has sold out literally there when there become no more copies available for people to purchase, then the publisher says, oh, we got to do a second printing, or we might want to do a new edition. First of all, congratulations. What an incredible accomplishment. And second of all, what did you guys decide to change for the second edition or to add to make it sort of relevant, 10 years later?
Thank you. Well, it was interesting when I first polled some of the instructors who used my book in their classes and asked them about writing a second edition. They said, sure, go ahead, but don't make it any longer than it already is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very short and readable, which I love.
Yeah, they really, really appreciated the fact that it was short and concise. They reminded me of some other books that had gone on to further, editions, second, third, fourth, fifth editions, getting longer and longer and longer with each edition, which they didn't want me to do. They said, keep it the same length. So I really didn't. I reviewed the literature that had been written on scientific writing, or at least did my best job at reviewing the literature. Between the first edition and this second edition, so 10 years roughly of, and what's been anything new? What are scientists saying now about scientific writing? And it was interesting because scientists are doing more, or the scientists who are interested in writing are doing more analysis of writing and finding that there's been an increase in acronyms, for instance. There's been an increase in technical jargon, for instance. And what effect does that have on citation rate, for instance, which was an interesting question. And it turns out that the more acronyms and the more jargon you have in your writing, the fewer times it's cited, because people just don't remember it as well. And there was some interesting research that I described in there that was being done by interdisciplinary groups. So economists working with biologists or things like that, and the difficulties they were having because each of them has their own language and their own terminology and technical terms, and it was very difficult. These authors were saying to try and bridge the gap between these two silos, these language silos, and be able to produce writing about their research that would be understandable to both groups of readers. So that was interesting, and the research on that Yuri Hassan has been doing was included, and the FOVIA information was included. So there was some new information, some reorganization. There was some replacement of difficult examples that I felt could be made more simple, and I had other examples. So it's better organized. There are all the exercises that are provided at the end of the short chapters are doable, and they're not too hard. And then the biggest thing that is the difference between the two editions is the teacher's guide. So I spent a lot of time putting together, and it's now free online at University of Chicago Press for instructors. This teacher's guide, which it's large. It has 70 downloadable documents in it that describe all kinds of very cool activities, class activities, assignments, both long and short assignments that could take, the long ones would, some of my long assignments would take half a semester to do while we were doing lots of other things. And also some really good information there about how to support students and make them their time in your class successful. So I did a lot of one-on-one tutoring, for instance, with my students. And I had smallish classes. I had like between 25 and 30 students. So I could organize one-on-one tutoring, and that the student said was the most helpful part of the course. So I described how I did the one-on-one tutoring, how you make the student do all the work, how you just ask questions and make that, and get the student to find out what by reading aloud, like we were talking about earlier, they're writing out loud, and all of a sudden they stop and say, "Whoa, that doesn't sound very good, does it?" And you say, "Well, what do you think is wrong? Or what do you think could make it better? And we just covered it in class this afternoon," or whatever, And it works very well. And they all vast majority of my students found that the most useful part of the course. And then peer tutoring, how to do that. What do you do about plagiarism what's your university's take on plagiarism? And now it's with AI.
And now AI, I know.
ChatGPT, it's a huge issue. So policies about plagiarism and what you can do to help your students through that whole quagmire. And so the support part of the teacher's guide is really good too, but there's a lot of assignments and activities described in it that for sure there will be something for everybody, something useful in that teacher's guide for everybody who uses the book in their class.
Absolutely. And I mean, honestly, for anybody who writes or who is in a specialized field or who is engaged in anything technical, even if it's not, traditionally what we think of as science, but something STEM fields, or even like, gosh, let's say I use this example all the time, but like, I don't know how to communicate with my plumber because my plumber uses all sorts of specialized language that I never learned, And so if my plumber could communicate in plain English, I may understand plumbing a little bit better. And I think that really does apply to so many technical fields, even beyond science. And so I just have to thank you so much for, for like all of your hard work over the years, learning about this and really refining your approach and refining how to teach so many people to improve their science writing. Because, gosh, I think it's an immeasurable outcome, really. The things that we know or will know because of a generation of people who can communicate their concepts more plainly, it's immeasurable and invaluable.
Yeah, and we need a science literate population.
Yeah.
We need we need a science literate a group of politicians. We are facing huge problems, and we have to turn this around. We have to turn around people's concept of science and make them somehow engender trust again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely agree. There is
Yeah.
a whole other side to this that we didn't even get to, but I
True.
hope that those who listen to the show week after week probably know where I stand on that and are nodding vigorously along with what you're saying right now.
Good.
So yeah, I have to thank you for not just the hard work in your career and in making this edition available to us, but also in taking the time out of your schedule today and teaching us and informing us and helping us get excited about science writing. Thank you so much for being here. It was a real blast.
You're welcome. And it was fun to talk to somebody who is already so excited about this subject like you are, Karen. So thank you. Thank you very, very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.